it's going to be posted on Facebook and YouTube.
Good, good, good. Okay, just want to make sure I didn't have to, that I was not derelict in not doing something. Excellent.
Jeff, I believe it's 12 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started if that's all right with you.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. Just PowerPoint from last time and ready to go. Okay, ready when you are.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marilyn Wills, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Tyler-Smith County. And we welcome you to our 2021 Great Decisions Lecture Series. Lots of you probably have joined us for the past over 30 years for these lectures on where we've explored lots of international topics. And so you may know, but I'm going to just make sure the audience is aware that these lectures are brought to you by a collaboration. And that includes the League of Women Voters of Tyler-Smith County. And we're a nonpartisan voter education organization and advocacy. And our mission is to educate, register, and ultimately get people out to vote. The second partner in this is AAUW, which is American Association of University Women of Tyler. And they're dedicated to the advancement of gender equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy. The Tyler Public Library is our third partner, and normally we would be in the Tyler Library Auditorium having cookies and coffee and tea, but because of COVID, things have changed, so we're going virtual. And then the last partner is the National Foreign Policy Association, and they set up the topics for discussion each year, and then we find local, in this case, not so local, people with the areas of expertise to help us understand the topics even better. I say usually it's local, but this year we're really pleased that we have a local professor, Dr. Jeffrey Crean, who is has agreed to be the coordinator of our lecture series. And we're really pleased about that. And as it happens, Dr. Crean is also going to be today's first speaker. And before I get to the introduction of Dr. Crean, let's just do a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, I want everyone to be aware that this is being recorded, and the recordings will be on Facebook from the League of Women Voters and also on YouTube. So if, and we'll do this for each one of the 8 lectures. So if for some reason you can't join us on Zoom for one of the lectures, you can go to Facebook and actually review it there. Questions are going to come at the end of each session. And so if you'll use your chat box for any questions that you have, then they will be given to the speaker at the end of the session. Then hopefully we'll have at least 10 minutes after Dr. Crean finishes to respond to questions. Does that work for you, Dr. Crean?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Crean. He's a professor of history at Tyler Junior College. Previously, he taught at Blinn College, Texas A&M University, and the Bush School of Public Policy and International Affairs. He received his Ph.D. in history from Texas A&M University in 2017. His research interests include the interaction of U.S. foreign relations with domestic politics, as well as war and public opinion. He has previously published articles in Diplomacy and Statecraft, War and Society, and the Journal of American East Asian Relations, and was contracted in September by Bloomsbury Press to write a book entitled The Fear of China in International History. Dr. Crean, the presentation is yours.
Thank you, Marilyn, for that excellent introduction. I'm now going to share my screen so you'll be able to see my PowerPoint. Let's see. Is my PowerPoint visible? Marilyn?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let's see here.
Tammy, can we?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Tammy, yes. Is my PowerPoint visible?
No. Have you shared it yet?
I shared my screen, and this is it's currently screen 2.
No, I don't see it.
Okay, it's showing. Okay, it's showing screen 1. Let's see here. So I'm going here. I have share screen. I press share screen, and I go to my presentation. Is it visible now?
It's coming up. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you can see China and Africa.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, good. Okay, so you can see China and Africa, and now I will go full screen with that. So it is up, and you can see me as well?
Yes.
Okay, you can see me on the presentation. Excellent. Okay. So today we're talking about China and Africa, China's involvement in Africa, past, present, and future, and its relations, of course, to the United States and United States interests in Africa and relative to China. Before I begin this, I'd like to begin with a recent news story. So Jack Ma is the head of Alibaba, one of China's largest corporations, its largest e-commerce provider. So essentially he is one of the richest men in China, and you could compare him to Jeff Bezos in America. So Jack Ma on October 24th gave a speech in Shanghai in which he accused Chinese banks of having what he called a pawn shop mentality, where they were not encouraging entrepreneurial risk and allowing entrepreneurs to be bold enough to further China's economy. So by our standards, that is incredibly mild criticism. By China's standards, it's apparently not so, because he has not been seen or heard from since this October 24th speech. And the reason this is relevant to the talk today is because the reason we know, and it became clear on Monday that Mr. Ma was indisposed, was because Jack Ma had created a television show broadcast in numerous African countries entitled Africa's Business Heroes, a sort of Sino-African Shark Tank, if you will, where he spotlights various young African entrepreneurs, and they kind of rates them and things like that, and they pick a winner. It doesn't air until next spring, but he was tweeting before, and he was essentially letting known in October that he was looking forward to being the judge on the finals when they were recorded and taped in November, this past November. And when people were editing the footage and what have you this past week, they noticed one of Ma's associates or assistants was there in his place. And that's how they realized he was not there. Once this news got out to various outlets around the world on Monday, by Tuesday, one of his associates had said he is laying low at the moment. This is not unprecedented with Chinese business people or celebrities, where they run afoul of the government and the government reminds them in various ways, shapes, and forms who's boss, and that they can break you. They may not have made you, but they can certainly break you. And we'll see his act of contrition coming up. But nonetheless, the idea there is he was one of China's most prominent businessmen, their equivalent to Jeff Bezos, and he is known to not be there because he did not show up on his reality show set in Africa and aired in Africa and starring African entrepreneurs. So this indicates China's interest in Africa. You could not imagine, say, an American tycoon doing a business show in Africa, in part, as I'm going to explain, because we look at Africa in America in very different ways than the Chinese look at Africa. So now I will begin my presentation. So first, the topics. We'll overview of Africa in terms of its demographics, its size, its population, its economy in 2020 or now 2021. Second, we'll look at China's involvement in Africa during the Cold War, especially the 1960s and to some extent the 1970s, where China was competing with both the US and the Soviet Union for influence in that continent, with far more limited resources than it has today. Then we will look at China's recent economic involvement over the past 20 years, which is accelerating and becoming quite massive. We'll look at its military involvement, which is far more limited, but still increasing and often existing in conjunction, as you will see, with its economic activities. And then we will look at what Africans think about China's involvement, which is the most important thing. We look at what we think of it, what the Chinese designs might be, but of course the Chinese are not forcing themselves in terms of economic aid, economic investment, military bases on the African people and on Africa's leaders. They are inviting the Chinese and they are welcoming the Chinese. And it's important to understand what Africa's views and what the views of not only Africa's leaders, but Africa's people are on the Chinese vis-a-vis Americans. And that, as I'm going to say in the conclusion, is the most important thing to consider here. Not our feelings, but their feelings and their desires and their hopes. So first with Africa, if you teach a course in African history or African politics, there's two things you have to mention at first. First, Africa is a continent. It is not a country. It is a continent containing more than 50 nation states. First, it is a continent. It is not a country. And secondly, it is a massive continent. It is the second largest continent to Asia in terms of its geographic size. And it is currently the second largest continent in terms of population, again, next to Asia. And so this is, and so as I say here, its current population is estimated last year at 1.34 billion, which is 17% of humanity. It is more people than live in the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, North, South, Central America, the Caribbean, far fewer people than currently live in Africa. This would not have been the case in the past. Its population is, in addition to being the second largest in the world, it is the fastest growing of a continent in the world by far. Asia's population is slowing down massively. Europe's has stagnated, and the Americas, similar sort of thing. Africa's population is still growing quite rapidly, as you see here. There were, 1.34 billion today, 800 million 20 years ago, 500 million 40 years ago. And it's estimated that this population will continue to grow to, and of course, these sort of population estimates several decades out are always incredibly inexact, but the most accurate one at the moment is that the population will reach 2.5 billion by 2050, at which point it will constitute 25% of humanity. Of course, Africa is very large geographically, very diverse, and we're dealing, in addition to more than 50 nations, hundreds of languages, thousands of ethnic groups, so on and so forth. It is also, in addition to being large and growing both in terms of population and its economy, it's also the poorest continent with the smallest gross domestic product of any continent, despite its large and growing population of so the entire continent's economic output in 2019 was estimated at $2.4 trillion. By comparison, the US and China, depending on how you measure it, each have an economy upwards of $20 trillion. So we're dealing with a growing economy, but it's still a very small economy, a minor player on the world's economic stage, which is in part why the US does not look to China as a source of economic opportunity. The Chinese look at it as a source of investment, as a place to situate factories and so on, and to get raw materials. When the US thinks of China, thinks of Africa as a continent, it still has very much that sort of, we are the world, USA for Africa approach to it, Live Aid and so forth, where we see it as a place of starvation, of suffering, as an outlet for charity in more recent decades in terms of providing AIDS drugs and so forth. The other way you think of Africa, if you are, say, an evangelical or a member of an American proselytizing religion, as a setup for missionary activity. But if you ask, if you did the Family Feud thing and say, we asked 100 Americans, what word comes to mind when you think of Africa? Economic opportunity would not be on the top 5 list. And in China, that would be very different. It would probably be number 1 or number 2. Now, I mentioned the size of Africa. The fact that it's the second largest continent may not be readily apparent based on our standard Mercator projections of the globe, which are designed to make the mid-latitudes where Europeans and Americans live look most accurate, but very much distorts enlarges the the poles and crunches the middle, the equatorial regions where Africa is. So on this standard map, you see giant Greenland, giant Canada, Africa about this, slightly larger than South America, about the same size as Greenland. This is, of course, not accurate in terms of its size. So this is in part why we underestimate Africa, both not only in terms of population, but also in terms of just simply geographic square mileage. Now, more recent projections, which are distorted in a way to try to accurately convey the size of various continents, this makes it more obvious here. This is a bit distorted, but it kind of makes up for what the equatorial regions lose in terms of the Mercator projection. So as you see here, some of Africa's size. Another good way to illustrate the size of Africa geographically is by showing how many other countries can fit inside it. And this is something people will also do on their first class for teaching anything about Africa. You see here, the United States fits snugly in West Africa, China in South and Central Africa, India in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, most of Europe and the rest. So, we're talking about, vast swaths of the world can fit entirely inside this continent. And then you see on the right flank, all of Europe fits in there quite easily, all of India, Japan, hardly noticed, China, United States, about the same size. So this indicates the size of the region we're dealing with, and whenever you're dealing with a region that vast geographically, there's going to be diversity in groups, climates, geography, economic endowments, agriculture, all those sorts of things. So this is important to understand Africa as a continent, as diverse in some ways, more so in many ways than other continents. Now we'll get to China. So China has been involved in Africa since around the time, if not before, African nations became independent from being almost entirely colonized by the Europeans at the end of World War II to being mostly independent nations 20 years later. The vast swaths of the period where most African nations attained their independence largely from the British and the French was in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. In 1960 alone, nearly 20 African nations became independent as the Europeans were either forced out or decided it was no longer worth it and left these countries to their own devices. And so at that time, China was going to move in and offer itself as as a new friend, as a power which had not colonized them, which had not exploited them, which could in some ways help them and inspire them to follow the Maoist Chinese communist model. So in addition to being communist, China was non-white. So it was at this time the most powerful, at least militarily, Japan, more so economically, the most powerful geopolitical non-white nation on earth. And it was feared in the US and to a certain degree in the Soviet Union that China could use this to their advantage as kind of positioning itself as the leaders of the non-white races and peoples and ethnicities in not only Asia and Africa and but also Latin America. And so China, of course, at this time was a desperately poor nation, which had few resources to expend in its efforts to ingratiate itself to the rest of the world. It offered military assistance to insurgencies against the existing governments in Africa, also against some of the colonial regimes that still remained, such as in Angola, against the Portuguese and the white settler minority regime in Rhodesia, what is today Zimbabwe. These insurgencies nearly all failed. Often quite spectacularly, and left little mark, except in what is today Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe, who received military training in China and backing from China, was able to ultimately assume the presidency of an independent Zimbabwe in 1980 and ruled until quite recently. But by and large, those efforts failed and left behind, destruction, death, all those sorts of things. Their economic aid, again, very limited. It tended to, their approach relied upon the Chinese aid workers living in the communities themselves in ways Soviet or American aid workers would not, who, the Americans would come and to say Ghana or something and build a dam. And they'd live in their own kind of like little quasi-colonies and so forth and not associate with the locals too much. The Chinese would go into a village and help out with the farm work and be directly involved. So this was far more limited than US or Soviet involvement, but nonetheless was, in the small places it went, it left less of a bad taste than, say, other actors involved. The one large development project, they also disseminated large amounts of Maoist propaganda, which found some favor, again, among a few leaders of Africa and among various dissidents and so forth. The Chinese at this time were printing billions of copies of Mao's Little Red Book of Sayings in the 1960s. At one point, they had more copies printed than there were people on Earth. And so they were very much trying to extend, their image as kind of this new form of communism, not as kind of boring and state and bureaucratic as the Russian Soviet form. One big project that they did, which left a lasting infrastructure impact on Africa, was a railroad they did from Tanzania, which is along the southeast coast of Africa, to Zambia, which is north of what is today Zimbabwe and in landlocked. Zambia has large copper reserves and large copper mines. And they built a railroad to allow an additional point of access so Zambia could export its copper through Tanzania rather than through white-ruled Rhodesia and white-ruled South Africa, as had been the practice beforehand. This was spent at a time where China's infrastructure was quite decrepit. There was massive amounts of money in the late 1960s and 1970s that the Chinese spent, which they really could not afford to spend, but nonetheless, they did build the railroad, in part with assistance from a road the Americans had built from Zambia to Tanzania to ingratiate themselves with those countries. And they used that to help bring supplies for constructing the railroad. So this shows some of the propaganda the Chinese issue at this time, this idea of Chinese, Africans, and others fighting their oppressors. And that little man with the hat and the missile and the large nose at the bottom, that is General MacArthur, who was generally, because of his actions during the Korean War, which China got involved with against the Americans, kind of the stand-in at this time for what they saw as US imperialist activities. So this shows an example of that. Another one here, which I refer to as kind of the communist version of the United Colors of Benetton, where you see these individuals of all races and ethnicities in their brightly colored garments, fighting the anti-imperialist struggles in what would become the Third World, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And you'll notice the African, again, breaking his chains, as in the previous picture, is in the foreground of this picture. So China, such as it had resources to expend, expended them disproportionately in sub-Saharan Africa, usually with little to show for it. And in this, it was no different than the US or the Soviet Union, which expended far greater resources and had similar sorts of lack of impact. Yet in China's case, they could afford them far less. And so this shows the other side of it, the humanitarian side, not just that they're encouraging insurgencies, that they are encouraging, humanitarian activities, doctors, nurses, helping, African women and children in this case. So they tried to show a more, that this shows the economic aid side as well. Now, the peak of China's influence in Africa and in the developing world at large was in around 1964. And this is Zhou Enlai, the Chinese leader of Chinese foreign policy, one of their leading officials in their government on the left, meeting here in Ethiopia with their emperor at the time, Haile Selassie. It was a massive tour of more than a dozen countries made by Zhou Enlai that year in Africa, trying to show China's, caring about the continent and its involvement. China's foreign policy turned inward in the late 1960s for domestic reasons, and what little influence they had gained, they quickly lost, with a few exceptions. One being Tanzania, the place where China built the railroad. The reason they did is because Tanzania was the one country in Africa at this time with a leader who was openly supportive of Mao, who remained in power for a long time. That man on the right is a young Julius Nyerere. He is the first leader of an independent Tanzania, was their dictator for several decades. And you see him on the left, the man on the left being Mao Zedong, China's leader from 1949 until his death in 1976. And here they are meeting in the mid-60s. You can see a similar picture of a graying Julius Nyerere in 1974 meeting a Mao clearly ailing and in the process of dying from ALS, from Lou Gehrig's disease. So he tried to create his own Maoist sort of cult of personality, his own little book of sayings and so forth in Tanzania itself. And so the Chinese, when they became more economically involved in the last 10 to 20 years in a larger sort of way, a very different China, a China, while still authoritarian and with a Marxist, Leninist, Bolshevik structure of government, had embraced capitalism, they pointed these things out, that we had been there before, we tried to help you before, we're here again. So they tried to form a sort of continuity. And this is China's current leader, Xi Jinping, who has been the leader of China since November 2012 and aspires to be a ruler for life, as Mao Zedong was. And here he is with Tanzania's current leader, and the trip he made there a couple of years shortly, this is in 2013, so this is less than a year after Xi Jinping has assumed the leadership of China, and he gets to Tanzania, and in the first speech, he reminds them of all the effort they did building that railroad. So therefore, China draws up, they see their previous involvement as a positive aspect, and they try to, remind Africans of that continuity. Now, as for that recent economic involvement, Chinese trade with Africa jumped above U.S. trade with Africa in 2009, and it's increased by leaps and bounds since then, such that last year was quadruple U.S.-Africa trade. Furthermore, their investment in the tens of billions of dollars is double that of U.S. investment on the continent. And most of Chinese investment, by the way, especially loans that they give, are from Chinese state banks. So a lot of this is, part of it is economic, part of it is also to gain political influence in ways the Americans would not, where America has much more of a separation between the public and private sectors. In China, it's much more fuzzy by design. And so why is China involved in Africa? Africa has a lot of oil, minerals, rare earth minerals, which are important to a Chinese industry. It also has, there are certain vital parts of your cell phones, many of them made in China, which could not exist without certain minerals, which only exist in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so that's important. They also receive a fair amount of food from Africa as well. And more recently, in addition to investing to try to get resources out of Africa, they're moving factories into Africa. This is as China gets wealthier, its low-skilled industries are being priced out of the international market. So the textile factories, which came from America and Mexico to China between 2000 and 2010, are now going to places like Bangladesh and Pakistan, and even more so now to Africa. For instance, it was noted shortly after Trump became president in 2017 that his daughter Ivanka Trump's line of clothing is made in China. In fact, many of them are now made in Africa. So for instance, Ivanka Trump brand shoes are made by a Chinese company in a factory that Chinese company owns in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. So Trump brand merchandise, instead of being made, it's labeled made in China, it's actually currently made in Africa. So that's another connection of how all these economies are intertwined in this era. Now, I'm going to focus here on the Horn of Africa, on East Africa, both on Ethiopia, a nation of 100 million, the second most populous nation in Africa next to Nigeria, which has about 200 million people today. It's a landlocked nation, as you see here. It's very large, has a lot of people, and it is, again, it's a classic example of kind of our USA for Africa charity view of the continent. When we think of Ethiopia, we think famine in the 1980s. We don't think, it's fairly substantial economic growth and population growth over the past decade. But it is landlocked, as you see here. It's also bordered by some fairly sketchy places. Somalia, a stateless state to its east, and then to its north, Eritrea, which used to be a part of Ethiopia, but fought successfully for independence in the 1980s and 1990s from that country. So Ethiopia needs to get its supplies out, its goods out that it produces to the rest of the world. And it does that through that small country in the middle, Djibouti, a former French colony strategically located where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden, emptying into the Indian Ocean, through which that little, you see where Yemen meets Djibouti, about substantial portion of the world's oil travels and many other goods. This is in part why you had so many Somali pirates in this region attacking container ships. The subject, of course, of Tom Hanks's Captain Phillips movie. So Ethiopia currently exports 90% of all exports from Ethiopia go through Djibouti, and they go on a series of poorly run, poorly constructed highways along, through trucks and so forth. So China noticed this and decided to build a modern railroad to replace these pre-modern roads from Addis Ababa to Djibouti City. And what they did is they built a 500-mile railroad at $3.4 billion, again, through loans to Djibouti and Ethiopia. So this is not foreign aid. This was loans from Chinese government-sponsored banks, which the nations of Djibouti and Ethiopia will have to pay off over time. Djibouti, by the way, compared to Ethiopia with 100 million people, Djibouti has only 1 million. It's mostly desert, but it does have one of probably the best port, the best natural port on the entire continent of Africa. It's the deepest port in Africa, where Djibouti City is. That's why the French colonized it way back when. And so, the Chinese are trying to, in this way, help Ethiopia and also help their factory owners who are, building their products, in factories, textile factories around Addis Ababa and along the line of this railroad. So here we see the railroad, which went into operation in 2018. We see, the trains and so forth that the Ethiopian Railways trains are running on in this currently, So this, in Ethiopia and Eritrea, they know it's a lot of debt and they have to pay it off. In the case of Eritrea, their debt to China is currently 70% of their GDP, so it's a substantial debt, but they see it as an investment because China is helping build port facilities and other roads and railroads and infrastructure, which they believe can grow their economy. The Americans look at this as a sort of almost like a sort of payday loan type thing, that China is coming in there and giving these loans, and when the loans aren't going to be paid up, they will repossess assets in Africa. Much as, curiously, European imperialists like the French and the British did in the late 19th and early 20th century in Africa and Asia and other places, where they would essentially repossess countries when those countries could no longer pay off their loans to them and their banks. Now today, of course, it's much harder, if not impossible, to repossess a country, let alone strategic assets within that country. So what China does with these debts, often if they can't be repaid on time, is they'll quietly try to push back the loan repayment schedule, as opposed to cutting the interest rate or doing a partial default or something. But nonetheless, it is the sort of thing where if they don't repay, both the Chinese and the Africans will lose, as opposed to a purely predatory thing. But Americans don't view it that way. So Mike Pompeo, he visited China in 2018. He went to 3 countries. He went to Senegal, which is in West Africa, which was the country where China has its most involvement in West Africa. He went to Angola in Southern Africa. Angola is one of Africa's second leading oil producer after Nigeria, and one of China's leading suppliers of oil. So he went there. And then he went to Ethiopia, and this is him in Ethiopia. You see him, next to him is the current president, is the then president of Ethiopia. And so he's going specifically to places where China has a lot of influence to warn them about Chinese influence. And he warns them about what he calls debt diplomacy. He is not, and he says they're trying to take advantage of you. Americans are offering what he called a true partnership, where they are, they're more looking after Africans, where the Chinese, in his view, are looking after themselves. He's not the first American Secretary of State to say this. Rex Tillerson, his predecessor, Donald Trump's first Secretary of State, accused the Chinese of predatory loan practices in Africa. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama's first Secretary of State, accused China of a new colonialism when she visited Africa. And President-elect Joe Biden's incoming Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, if and when he goes to Africa, will no doubt say the exact same thing. So as I don't have to tell you, on this day of all days, the Democrats and Republicans, there's a lot they disagree on. One thing they do not disagree on is China and the China threat. And you have Republicans and Democrats, Biden and Trump, included, competing over who can be tougher on China these days. So this is one of those rare areas of agreement in Washington. So economically, China is very involved, more involved than the United States, in part because their economy needs it more and has more natural complementarities with Africa. But nonetheless, that is a worry to the U.S. More so, in fact, as I will explain, than it is to the Africans themselves. Now, military involvement. America's military involvement in Africa, far more than it used to be, but still far more limited than it is on any other continent. The Africa Command was only instituted a couple of years ago to match our CENTCOM in the Middle East and NATO and South, our other regional commands for the military, and is still headquartered in Stuttgart for reasons of logistics and so forth in Germany, as opposed to in Africa itself. U.S. involvement in Africa is primarily counterterrorism, fighting, say, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, fighting Boko Haram in West Africa, in the Sahel region there, such as Niger and those sorts of countries. China's involvement is a bit different. They are more involved in training African armies and establishing person-to-person contacts, and it's also more integrated with their economic involvement. Where the U.S. is completely separate. There's no connection at all. There's no integration between our humanitarian aid, our economic investment, and our military involvement. They're working on completely separate checks. The Chinese are doing it differently. And Djibouti is a good example of that. The Chinese in 2017 established a naval base in Djibouti. They became involved in that region about 12 years ago, helping the U.S. and other navies fight Somali pirates. They proceeded to build a second port or expand the port facilities in Djibouti City. And then right next to that port, they were able to get their first overseas naval base where they have ships and so forth. This, by the way, Djibouti is very much a country which hedges its bets, as many small countries do. So about 10 miles to the south, to the south and to the west and to the east of the Chinese base is a much larger American base, where 4,000 U.S. troops are currently at this moment stationed, working with mostly piloting drones and training special forces and deploying special forces to fight Islamic insurgents and other terrorist forces in Somalia. So, literally down the road, a 15-minute drive, you have the Chinese base, you have the American base, and in between you have a French base, this being a former French colony. So they are, they're, like a lot of African countries, getting benefits from both nations. This again distinguishes it from the Cold War, where you sided with the US, or you sided with the Soviets, or you sided with the Chinese, who were at odds for much of the period with both the Soviets and the Americans. And so you pick the side. Often you would switch sides, but you usually pick the side. Today, they're much more hedging their bets and taking benefits, economic, and in this case, military, from both countries. And that is different. That is very different, and one of the many differences between kind of the original Cold War and what people now call the burgeoning US-Chinese Cold War. And economically, it's also very different as well, in the sense that the US and Soviet economies were barely integrated, were almost entirely separate in how they operated and distinct from each other. Whereas, of course, the US and Chinese economies are enormously enmeshed with each other. So you have African countries dealing economically and militarily with both the US and the Chinese at the same time. And meanwhile, the US and the Chinese, while we're competing with each other and see each other as rivals, our economies are inextricably intertwined as well at the moment. And again, that makes it more difficult to have a straight up kind of rivalry as we did with the Soviets, where we were operating in virtually separate spheres. Now, a good example of China and the Chinese cultural idea of Africa when it comes to security issues is this movie that came out in 2017, Wolf Warrior 2, which is the most successful, highest grossing Chinese film ever. It's the highest grossing film in China ever. More than any American import, it has blown them all out of the water, made the equivalent of nearly $1 billion in China in that year in 2017. The man you see up top, the largest figure here, he is the title character. He's something of a Chinese Rambo. He's, he left the military on, in part because of, he was insubordinate and so forth. He has a dark side to him, but he happens to be wandering through Africa, and somewhere in East Africa, there is a European warlord, the bearded guy on the right, who is terrorizing people and is kidnapped a Chinese-American doctor, female doctor, and he has to rescue her and other Chinese and American and European civilians from the evil white warlord and his African minions and so forth. And meanwhile, the Americans are feckless offshore and do nothing. So the Chinese to the rescue. And this is very much how, to a certain degree, China views Africa as an avenue for opportunity, where the Americans are not terribly involved, and they can be involved in some ways more so than the Americans. And they believe they can do so in a way which will ingratiate themselves with the local population. And this, not only in addition to being an enormously popular movie in China, the most popular ever, has influenced its sense of self in the world. For instance, you have diplomats who in China are far more aggressive now than they used to be under previous presidents. Under Xi Jinping, they're far more assertive in very undiplomatic ways, which has led to them being labeled by the press wolf warrior diplomats. You could not imagine, say, in America in the 1980s, even under Reagan, having Rambo diplomats. But nonetheless, they're seen as being more assertive of their nation's pride and their nation's interests. And this is why I bring this here, in addition to having the movie being set in Africa. Kind of going back to the beginning when we talked about Jack Ma and his show Africa's Business Heroes, the economic aspect of China's involvement, culture, and connection culturally to Africa. So now we get to, again, what do the Africans think of all this? The Americans think the Chinese are taking advantage of the situation, are being predatory, and don't have the African interest at heart, are practicing, as Hillary Clinton said, a new colonialism, extracting resources, giving loans that they will, that they don't expect to be paid back so they can repossess assets, those sorts of things. Now, they've done polls of, obviously, the African leaders don't mind the Chinese. That's why they invite them in. They've done numerous public opinion polls through many African countries, and they generally find that most Africans have their net positive view of China and the net positive view of the United States. They also have a net positive view of Chinese investments and economic involvement in their countries, and a net positive view of American economic involvement in their countries. And you'd think there'd be like a faction of pro-American Africans and a faction of pro-Chinese Africans, but there really isn't. By and large, those who, in these polls, who like China also like the United States. Those who welcome China being there also welcome the US being there. Whereas those who wish the Chinese would stay out also wish the Americans would stay out. So by and large, they are not looking at trying to, they are not taking sides as they would have during the Cold War, where you're either with the Soviets or with the Americans or maybe with the Chinese. Now they don't see the need to do that. They see the Chinese as helping build infrastructure, create jobs. The Americans similarly, they see as a net positive in terms of its involvement. So Africans are not worried about this. And so bringing that around, it's important to understand when we look at this issue again, considering what the Africans want, and which is what is essential here, and also what so I'm going to. Okay, going to go back to just looking at looking at me here, since I've gone through the PowerPoint. The question then becomes one of strategic empathy. That when we go to Africa, when our secretaries of state go there and tell them you're being played for suckers, they're not going to take it very well. And great powers in general have a difficult time empathizing with lesser countries. This is the case. It's definitely the case with China. It's always been the case with the United States. It's the case with any powerful nation, that you don't see the world through the eyes of those you're dealing with. We generally, to quote Thucydides' famous line about Athens, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And the strong always think they can do what they can and get away with it, as is in the case with Athens in the Peloponnesian War. They can't. In the end, they lose and bring their city-state to disaster. And it happens with plenty of other great powers as well. Pretty much all of them since then will overstep at a point. And it's important then for Americans to look at the issue of China and Africa through African eyes. And if we want them to like us as well or like us more, it's important for us, for America's leaders to try to understand why African leaders, African people would welcome the Chinese presence just as they welcome the American presence and work with it that way, as opposed to telling them you're being played for suckers, either it's us or them, make a choice. Again, that is what I leave you with, this need for strategic empathy, which is how to view these things, both strategic empathy and not to overstate the case. China's involvement in Africa is often greatly exaggerated. As I said, it is substantial, but for instance, with food, there's reports every now and then of the Chinese purchasing giant swaths of acreage, 10% of a country's farmland, blah, blah, blah. And then they look into these news reports and they find that it is either non-existent or greatly exaggerated. That you do have foreign companies from the US, from Europe, from China, buying land to supply products, in the case of Chinese soybeans and so forth, to their country. But it's instead of being, say, 10%, it's 1%. So it's very minor, and it's no different than what other nations and other agribusiness cooperatives are doing. And so it's important, again, not to exaggerate these things and lead us to act in ways which are self-detrimental. So I leave you with that. I turn this back over to Tammy, and I will now take your questions. So Tammy?
Thank you so much, Dr. Crean. That was very, very knowledgeable, very helpful, and we appreciate your vast knowledge in that area. We had originally asked that you put your questions in the chat area because of the amount of questions that would, but we don't actually have any in the chat. Is there anyone that would like to ask a question to Dr. Crean directly, since we don't actually have any in the chat?
If you don't have questions, there's one thing I wanted to mention early on in terms of China's past involvement with Africa is that it precedes the modern era. That in the early 1400s, decades before the Portuguese sailed to India or Columbus sailed to the Caribbean, the Chinese sent fairly substantial naval missions around Asia, past Malaysia and Indonesia, into the Indian Ocean, and beyond India up to what is today Iran and the Persian Gulf, and even to Africa. So they did 7 of these voyages over a 25-year period, and they landed, we don't know, given the limited amount of records of these things, we do know that they probably landed in what is today Tanzania, around Zanzibar, and possibly also briefly in Somalia. And the Chinese, by and large, forgot this rather impressive exploit of theirs for centuries, really until recent years, where it's kind of the admiral who led these, Zheng He, who led these expeditions, has become kind of their patron saint, their sort of, their kind of founding figure. So, the Chinese, I'm sure whenever they go to East Africa, will no doubt bring this up, that, our connections go back 600 years before most Europeans, certainly before the Americans. Very limited contact, but nonetheless, it's important to understand in terms of how their national self-image and their connection to Africa at this time. I believe I saw a couple questions in the chat room.
Yes,
Tammy, do you have
yeah, I'll go ahead and start with the first one.
Excellent.
Heather, last October, our national security advisor stated that Beijing promotes a journey to China independence, while the U.S. promotes a journey to self-reliance. Dr. Crean, you have addressed this comment. Dr. Crean, you have addressed that this comment may not be well received. Do you see it as accurate?
I don't see it as entirely accurate. There's a point there. For instance, Chinese company built a port in Sri Lanka, which the government did not have the wherewithal to pay for. And when the Sri Lankans defaulted on the debt on that port, the Chinese company seized it, which proved very unpopular in Sri Lanka and led to problems for that government leader. But nonetheless, so there can be dangers to this, but I think it is by and large mutually beneficial. And America has is understandably suspicious of these things. But yes, you are correct, Heather, in that I do see that as, if not a falsehood, certainly an exaggeration. That American companies and businesses invest in Africa for their self-interest, just as Chinese companies and the government does. But I don't see it in a way as predatory, and generally it would not go over well, and the Africans don't see it that way as well, and no doubt bristle when we say they're being taken for suckers.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question from Jackie. Would you comment on the value of appointing African American diplomats to African countries?
Yes, I think it can be important, less so than in the past. One of the reasons China was involved in Africa in the way it was, in emphasizing itself as a non-white power in the early 1960s, was that America still had Jim Crow. And often when African diplomats came to America and would journey, say, from the United Nations in New York City to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., they'd have to travel on roads through Delaware and Maryland, and they would get pulled over by cops. They'd go to restaurants and be unable to and refuse to be served and things like that. And they'd actually get warnings about this, and the American State Department would try to finesse this and so forth. So that has often been an issue. Also, of course, back then the United States was a strong supporter of white-ruled South Africa. And now, of course, those things are no longer the case. South Africa is not is no longer ruled by its white minority. The U.S. no longer has Jim Crow. So I think it is important, though less so than it would have been, say, in the 1970s, where this was a major issue, where Carter, for instance, appointed Andrew Young not as an African American, not as a diplomat to Africa, but as a representative to the United Nations to show Africans what the status of African Americans in America was. So I think it is important, but it's not as there's not that sense of as much nowadays, as there would have been at the time of independence. So that is important to understand as well. So, but yes, that was always a big issue with U.S. involvement and U.S. worries about Chinese involvement in Africa, that the Americans felt insecure about their own race relations and racial situation, and feared the Chinese would exploit this in many nations in Africa and beyond. The Chinese, by the way, are by no means free. Like all nations have their own forms of race and color prejudice. And African students, of which there are many tens of thousands in China, often report discrimination and being treated poorly for rightly suspected racial reasons. There was also in 2018 at one of China's leading programs of the Chinese New Year. They have this program which is basically like seen about as popular there as the Super Bowl is here. It's a variety show seen by an estimated 700 million of China's 1.4 billion people. And they had a skit in 2018 about how much Africans love Chinese and about how much Chinese love Africans. And the skit was set in Africa. So they had African characters in it, except the African characters were played by Chinese actors in blackface, in wigs, and so forth. The Chinese on Chinese social media, people immediately started posting, "This is going to go over badly. This was a mistake on the part of the network to do this." The Chinese had to, in that case, they did not apologize. What they did is they tried to turn it into the Americans and the others who are bringing up this issue are just trying to make us look bad. And so they tried to deflect on it. But that was an issue of how Chinese insensitivities on these issues can, in terms of the racial aspect, I'm speaking about, the question in a broader way, can figure into this as well. So I think it is important, getting back to the original question, but not as much as it would have been in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, when the situation was much different.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions that need to be directed to Dr. Crean today? Okay, we would like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for being our lecture series today, Dr. Crean, and facilitating this lecture series in general. I would like to invite everyone next week, January 4th. There'll be a lecture delivered by Dr. Christine Blackburn. She'll be presenting the role of international organizations in a global pandemic, specifically talking about COVID-19 pandemic and the thrust into the World Health Organization into the limelight. So that is going to be in our series next week. It will be the same Zoom link as it was today. And we would like to thank you so much, Dr. Crean, today for helping us and giving us all this wonderful information. And if there's no other questions, I think that we will just say goodbye and see everybody next week. Thank you once again, Dr. Crean. I think you've got quite a few applause and thumbs up out there.
Thank you very much. And I enjoyed it, and I hope the audience there got a lot of it as well.